Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope you can all hear me. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and this is our regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live Think-In, which we do in partnership with Santander. Definitely the coolest slot on the Tortoise weekly Think-In schedule. I would say that, wouldn't I? But we try to be topical. My favorite story of the week, as I was saying just before we started, at least in vaccination terms, is that if you go to Dracula's castle in Brasov in the mountains of Romania, if you are a EU or a Swiss citizen, you can get a free COVID vaccination. And I think you get a souvenir that shows you getting punctured by a needle as opposed to a vampire, which creates a sort of impression of abundance of vaccine. And as you saw in one of those slides just now, the similar impression is given in certain parts of the world. Canada, 6 times as many vaccines ordered, I don't think yet stockpiled, but ordered as citizens. The UK, 3 times as many. But that, of course, is not the situation worldwide. We will get sort of details on this as we go ahead, but I think the broad picture now is that about 0.3% of more than 1.5 billion doses so far distributed have gone to the lowest income countries, the couple of dozen poorest countries in the world. In other words, the equitable distribution that many people were calling for last year simply hasn't happened. Let's not kid ourselves. And meanwhile, we've had in the UK, even though we've got an expensive and broadly successful vaccination program, a real reminder of the old cliché, which turns out to be true, that no one's safe until everyone's safe. We've got flare-ups of the so-called Indian variant in many places, including Bolton, and we'll talk about Bolton in a little bit. But I hope that over the next hour, we can answer the question, how can we vaccinate the world, but also address the logistics, address some of the ethics, including I hope we can get to whether we need to free up all the IP associated with vaccines, or whether Big Pharma can provide enough doses without that. We have some really great guests with global and local expertise and everything in between. I'll introduce them in a second, but let me first give our ritual reminder that this is really about everybody else in the room. We want to hear from you. We have that loosely enforced no questions rule, easily misunderstood. That just means tell us what's on your mind. You don't have to ask a question. You can if you want. And please take part in the chat, or you can raise your electronic hand. Now, straight to it. We are joined by Yasmin Qureshi, MP for Bolton South East. Yasmin is also Shadow Minister for International Development. By Dr. David McNair from the One Campaign, where he is Executive Director for Global Policy. Professor Sophie Harman, Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University London, and also, this is my paraphrase, a specialist in global health studies. And Sophie Roberts, journalist and author, joining us from a quarantine hotel in Lisbon, recently returned from Nepal. So I hope we'll be able to get snapshots as well as big pictures. Can I start by coming to you, Yasmin? Because I'd like to know, first of all, how things are in Bolton, in your constituency, basically. Just one stat from a Guardian piece in which you are quoted, and I don't know, this may already be out of date, that in the week to 12th of May, Bolton was recording the highest case number per 100,000 in the country at 275, substantially higher than the second highest. Do you know if that's still the case? But more broadly, how's it going in terms of getting vaccines into arms?
Okay, so it was higher. I don't think it's as high as it is now. I mean, I had facts and figures come through this morning from the Northwest Regional Health people. Obviously, the rates are still increasing. But I think the most important thing is, and this is really important, is that hospitalization rates have not been exceeding. And that's really important because it means that people may be getting the infection, but it's not transmitting into being something that they have to go into a hospital. So which is a good thing. Now, it's interesting that the debate about the infection rate has got conflated with the issue of vaccination, because typical, Matt Henkel throws the comments in. So people start thinking that somehow the infection rate being high is linked with people not taking our vaccination. I think we need to just uncouple that myth, because amongst a certain group, the vaccination rate is quite high. I mean, when we're talking about, already a lot of people, more than 60-70% of people are vaccinated. It's the fact that we haven't, in some groups, reached the 95% and 97% vaccination rates. So I think we just need to be clear on that. And the reason for that is more or less, certainly in my part of the Bolton, because Bolton has 3 MPs and I'm just one of them. And in my part, the way the rollout took place was a little bit different to the way it was done in other parts of Bolton. And that's a lot to do with the dynamics of Bolton. And, it was a different group who rolled it out. And what they did is they rolled it out in one venue in the town centre, which was quite a small venue. Didn't have a proper parking facility, didn't even have anywhere for people to wait. So you had sometimes queues of an hour long, people waiting in December, November, January in the cold with snow, rain and everything. And with only about 5 to 6 vaccinators in that particular premises. So
just to be clear, there was one place in the whole of south of your constituency.
Yeah, in the whole of my constituency, one vaccination centre in the town centre with 5 or 6 vaccinators.
Do you know why it was that they weren't using, for example, NHS surgeries, as has been the case, and pharmacies, as in most of the country?
Well, this is the interesting question, is exactly why didn't they use all of this? And why didn't they roll out in big community centres and vaccination centres? So when I found out, because I tried to check on figures and what's happening in my constituency, when I found out what had been happening, back in sort of early February, I then contacted the clinical commissioning group, the people who were rolling out the vaccine who had the contract, and the local authority. And I think we had quite a fiery meeting where I basically said, you've got what, 6/7 of my constituency. We're talking about probably 70,000 people here, and you've got one little vaccination centre. Why have you not got at least 2 or 3 in the community, in different parts of the constituency? Because the way it was, I've got people living in Kersley and Farnworth, and for them it takes 3 buses to get into the town centre, about 2 hours of travelling. So I said, why didn't we have a vaccination centre which is local to Farnworth and Kersley, and then one maybe in the BL3, BL4 area, which is everybody talks about, Dean and Dobble. And I said, there are community facilities, places of worship, wedding venues and others available. I said, why haven't you used them? Why haven't you employed more vaccinators? Why have you used these facilities? They even made a mistake as to how much vaccination they thought they needed. They even ordered less than what was actually required even in the first sessions. So, I mean, I have to say, we had a very strong disagreement. And I then said, look, I want certain things happening in my patch. And eventually what happened is that to be fair, they kind of understood what I was saying. They said, yeah, we sort of agree with you. Although initially there was a reluctance by the person who was a clinical lead to say, oh, no, I don't think needed, we can do with this. And I said, no, because at the moment you were cohort 1 and 9. Okay, but that's not as big as some other parts of my constituency. But as your time goes by, and you're going to go into the rest of the cohorts, you're going to have a massive amount of people. And this one little vaccination centre in the town centre is not right. So we then, after our discussion and consultation, they then started having what they call ad hoc pop-up things in parts of the community. And then the bus came in as well. And then, more recently, they had this massive a temporary place in Asser Academy, which is bang in the middle of the community. It's bang in the middle of the people it needs to reach to. and you saw the queues, thousands of people got
Yep.
vaccinated. So, I mean, I'm probably very unpopular with my local CCG and everybody else. They probably, next time they see me, they probably put the cross in front, you know. So, but I'm afraid this is the part, right? And that's why I got really angry with Matt Hancock and his comment, because we've had a slow
Just to be
upset.
clear, you broadly accused him of sort of thinly veiled racism.
Well, I did,
Yeah.
because what happened is, as a result of the comments he made, and because everybody talks about the Indian variant, a lot of people thought, oh, that means people have been traveling to India and they brought it back. So a lot of people have been making that kind of leap of judgment. And there may well be some, but actually you have to understand, right, the Indian variant is all over the place in other countries as well. So we don't know who could have brought it. And what I thought, and I got emails, I got a number of emails from people who said to me, were quite racist and offensive. They said, well, you know what, it's you people or something like that. You people have been traveling abroad, but we British have stayed in the country. And that's the kind of thing that, this is what I said when I spoke in Parliament a few days ago. Politicians actually across the board have to be very careful with the language they use, because they might not mean as much harm. I'm sure he didn't think much about it, but the repercussions it has on people who don't normally sort of think for themselves independently what it means is to rush to condemn.
Right.
And I mean, it's the same when I've criticized my CCG rollout. I've had email people saying to me, oh, you're criticizing the NHS. And I said, no, I'm not criticizing the NHS. The wonderful doctors, nurses, porters, cleaners, right? They're wonderful. But let's face it, sometimes the management, administration, and the bureaucrats don't get things right. And that's what we're talking about. It's not criticism of anyone.
Yasmin, you started by saying rates are still going up, and it may be too soon to judge this, and neither of us are epidemiologists, but there is a risk, isn't there, that if you don't control an outbreak, especially of this highly transmissible variant early, it gets out of control. What are you being told about the likelihood of infection rates going on up? Obviously, it's great news that it's not translating at the moment into a surge in acute hospital care, but are infection rates themselves being brought under control?
I think they certainly are trying to bring them under control, but I think some of them have been in sort of like kind of younger demographics. So recently there was a news at Asser Academy, which has a lot of young people in it. Apparently there was an outbreak of it there. And so it's happening. But I think, and you know, I suppose vaccination is one aspect of all of this. But of course, there is the other aspect of it, which it would help tremendously in controlling infection. And again, this is something I mentioned quite a lot recently, is about the issue about self-isolation. You can't really stop infection spreading unless you are able to help people to self-isolate safely. And the problem with that is a lot of people in my constituency are on 0-hour contract, insecure work. If they, for example, didn't go to work, they might get sacked or they may not even get anything. And whilst the government says we have put self-isolation support payment, the rules regarding how it can be given are so vague and abstract and so difficult to apply. I've had constituents write to me saying, I've applied for this self-isolation payment and it's been refused. And actually, a little piece of news nobody talks about is that recently there was an article where they've studied which councils have been giving out these support payments, and Bolton Council in the whole country has been the worst in actually giving support to anyone. They've been the most hardest to access. And the truth is, if you're traveling on public transport, a lot of people who work in my constituency are people who are frontline workers or who can't work from home, majority of them. So they're your factory workers, the hospital workers, the public transport workers, they travel on public transport, they live in small houses, intergenerational homes. If somebody becomes unwell in their home, there might be 6, 7 people living in a 2-bedroom house. You know, where do you expect them to go and self-isolate? They're not going to I was going to say, do you expect them to go in a shed, but they don't even have gardens to have a shed that they can go and self-isolate. So obviously things are going to, you know, contamination rates are going to be higher than, you know, much suburban places. Like in my house, when I got COVID, I live in a lovely house and I have sufficient room that I was able to isolate in my room without affecting my family at all. But majority of people in my constituency are not in that privileged position.
Right.
Therefore, there are central issues, what this, I think, pandemic has highlighted about insecure payment and, of course, the issue of poverty and deprivation and housing. And I think these things need to be addressed as well to bring a curb to it.
Clearly, yes, it's multifaceted. Well, look, in Bolton, fortunately, no shortage of vaccine when it came to it. But David, I think I saw you nodding at the top when I mentioned this ballpark figure that for such a tiny number of the global number distributed going to poor countries. How dangerous is that, given that in many of these countries the infection rate is much lower as well? And what is to be done about it?
Well, Giles, we've heard again and again this phrase, you mentioned it, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. But the actions, particularly of rich countries, have not matched up to that rhetoric. At one, we have this, what we call the Africa COVID tracker, and it shows that 80% of the doses that have been administered have been administered in either high income or upper middle income countries. 0.4% have been administered in low income countries. Meanwhile, the rich countries have almost 2 billion doses more than they need. And that approach is unjust, it's short-sighted, and it's economically illiterate. The only way to end this pandemic is if we have a plan to reach global herd immunity, and that's 70% globally. But 18 months into the pandemic, we need to stop pretending that what is happening is close to good enough. We need a fully costed plan to get vaccines everywhere as fast as possible. We've been calling for 3 steps. The first is much greater commitments to dose sharing. So by this summer, supply will outstrip demand in most rich countries. So rich countries should commit to sharing 1 billion doses by the end of the summer, 2 billion by the end of the year. Secondly, we need full funding for these global initiatives. The International Chamber of Commerce has said that this approach of vaccine nationalism could cost the global economy $9 trillion, of which half would actually be borne by the rich countries because of supply chain constraints. But still, the mechanism for getting vaccines to the poorest countries still has a funding gap of 19 billion. Now, if you look at those numbers, 9 trillion of costs, 19 billion that still isn't being put into the mechanism to get vaccines to poor countries, it just doesn't make sense. And finally, we do need to scale up production, and that, there's discussion about IP and so on. Unless we make more vaccines and have them in the right places, we're not going to solve this problem. And to come back to your question, is this dangerous? The more people who are vulnerable to this virus, the more opportunities there are for this virus to mutate and threaten people in ways which could become more transmissible, more harmful to health, but also could become resistant to the treatments that we've already got. So this idea of let's vaccinate our own people and we'll be safe and the others, they can look after themselves. It just doesn't make sense. We've seen it, Yasmin already mentioned, how transmissible the so-called Indian variant is. There could be many more. There are already 4,000 variants out there. And in Africa, you've got 1.3 billion people who don't have access to a vaccine. So, you may think that
variants, you say?
4,000. And that's a year into the pandemic. The Economist Intelligence Unit predicts that it could be 2024 before everyone in Africa gets access to a vaccine. So if you think about that, the opportunity for more variants to grow, to become more dangerous, more transmissible, and threaten everyone, not just people in those poor countries, is, it's a real threat to us all.
David, let me just pick up on a couple of these stats. They're really useful. It'd be great if we had a live whiteboard to put new stats on. And then everyone.
Well, actually, we do have this portal. It's called the One Africa Tracker, which has all of these stats in it. I'll stick the link in the chat, and if anyone wants to take a look, then
that would be great. You've also got your VAT, the vaccine access test, which I wanted to ask you about. But first, you say rich countries have 2 billion more doses than they need. Is that on order? They've not already stockpiled that many, right?
No, that's on order.
Right.
But what we've done is we've looked at a kind of series of projections on when those vaccines will be delivered, and it's basically looking like I mean, in the United States, I think in a couple of weeks' time, they will have more vaccines to reach the demand of the people who actually want them,
right?
Than they need. I think in the UK, we're going to hit that milestone on August 17th.
Okay.
So we can share some of those stats. They're all in that tracker. But yeah, I suppose the kind of the core point is that we need to be making plans to share those vaccines now, because it's not just a matter of like, you know, sticking them on a plane. There are kind of indemnity agreements, there's approvals, there's lots of complexity that needs to be sorted out for those to be shared. But in sharing them, it's actually the most effective way of protecting, you know, our own citizens as well as everyone else.
Okay. So here's a practical question. I noticed yesterday that the EU had signed a deal with Pfizer for 1.8 billion doses, I think by the end of this year or next, 500 people in the EU. So then you're immediately up to 4 times more than the EU needs. So question about those sharing plans. Are they in fact already being made? And is the EU, just to take that as an example, ordering so many precisely in order to be able to share them on right away? I mean, will those vaccines ever touch down in the EU, or will they go straight on to Liberia?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I'm hoping that will be the case. But what needs to be done is that they need to be shared with this mechanism, COVAX.
Right.
Because, I mean, you may have seen some stories, you know, there was one recently in the DRC, another in Malawi, where countries have actually had to return or destroy vaccine doses that they've received. And that sounds like a terrible story. You know, these countries don't want it. Actually, what has happened is that they're prioritizing their most at-risk populations, but they've received doses very close to their expiry date. And, you know, to get the plans in place, to get the approvals, to get the indemnity agreements, it all needs planning. And that needs to be done in a coordinated way. And COVAX, you know, has the mechanisms to do that effectively. But this can't be a piecemeal thing. It needs to be planned out. So I don't know the answer to your question. I will try and find out before the end of our session. But I'm really hoping that will be the case, because, you know, this stockpiling by rich countries is just not a smart solution for anyone.
Right. Does it mean the fact that there's now this emphasis on persuading individual rich countries or blocks of rich countries to share, does that mean that the COVAX mechanism has, in a sense, already broken down, or was it always the point that COVAX would kind of beg and plead with the US and the EU for whatever doses it could get?
Well, the original plan back last year was that COVAX would aim to vaccinate 20% of the population in low-income countries. That's obviously not enough to get to herd immunity. It was a good start a year ago. Right. It's not good enough now. But in addition to that, a major supplier of COVAX was the Serum Institute in India, the world's largest vaccine producer, and they have now, you know, stopped exporting vaccines. Understandably, you know, that India is facing a heartbreaking and terrible crisis. They said this week that they hope, quote unquote, to start exporting by the end of this year. And that means that COVAX has, you know, they promised at this point to have delivered 170 million vaccines to low-income countries. They've delivered about 65. So, I mean, that was never planned for. What was planned for was reaching 20%. We need to get more than that, but we also need to address these kind of stockpiling issues that are you know, problematic for all of us. So the most recent initiative to get COVAX, you know, managing those rich country doses is partly a response to the fact that there are so many surplus, but also we're facing these supply chain gaps, particularly with the Serum Institute in India. Right.
There's a great and forgive me, I have a dog barking in the background, in Vox of the problems that COVAX is facing, and top of the list is money. Is it the case that the funding shortfall there, I mean, do you recognize the figure of $2.6 billion as the funding shortfall for COVAX to realize its goal of that 20%? And if so, I mean, Elon Musk could just write a check for that. How can the world fail to come up with that kind of a sum in this kind of an emergency?
Well, that's exactly the point that we've been making. And as I said before, International Chamber of Commerce has said the cost of this kind of approach of vaccine nationalism will cost the world, $9 trillion. The IMF has said vaccine policy is economic policy. So, I mean, there is a global health summit happening today, and I'm hoping that we'll kind of hear some good announcements, particularly from France and Italy. But yeah, to us, it's entirely baffling. I just don't understand why rich countries aren't seeing the car crash in front of us and doing something about it.
Thank you, David. Dog's going nuts. I'm sorry, there's someone knocking at the door. We'll just let that continue. I want to come to Sophie Harman first. You have studied Africa and in Africa a lot. And I remember when the first COVAX shipment arrived in Ghana, the point was made that it was overdue, it was needed, but that case rates were much lower there than in, say, on the west coast of the United States, where it was out of control and it was more urgent. How do you see the big picture as far as Africa is concerned? It seems to me, is it heading towards an Indian scenario unless we're careful, or is it heading for a more benign scenario where rates stay low even if vaccines don't get there in numbers?
Well, I think the classic COVID-19 response is we don't actually know, but we should plan for the worst. So I think lots of people look at Africa and say, oh, it's not as bad as we thought. Thank goodness for that, because it would be a nightmare. But that nightmare could happen. And I think the one thing that we've learned over the last year is you can't say what's going to happen with the virus, or which countries are doing well, etc. So I think that's why it's really important that we get the vaccines throughout the world, because we're all vulnerable because of international, travel, commerce, etc. However, I do really want to just pick up on some of the things that David was saying around COVAX. So I've actually been quite a critic around COVAX. I'm on the same side as David. I think we are looking at this absolute beast of a problem of trying to get vaccines into the world. But COVAX is a really outdated charitable model. It rests on this idea that we're going to put in development assistance to get these doses for 20% of populations in low-income countries around the world. That was always going to be met with a shortfall. Whenever you have these big, let's pledge the money, that never happens. And fundamentally, my problem is that states, when you ever talk to them about vaccine nationalism or, why don't you share your doses, they always say, oh, but look, we're investing in COVAX. We're the good guys. The big thing you've got to think about with COVAX, if you put aside the charity model resting on a very narrow manufacturing frame, is also, it's a whole sideshow to deflect from the wide issue of intellectual property as well. And we're only going to vaccinate the world once this issue is tackled. So COVAX was always doomed to fail, and it was always a diversionary tactic from this wider question of intellectual property. So if we're going to get serious, let's talk about that, I think.
Let's absolutely get serious. That is quite an accusation. Rather than me respond, let's go back to Yasmin, who's asked to do so.
So, any money that's given to a charity to help people is always welcome. But I entirely agree with Sophie in that COVAX is not the solution if you want to get the vaccination to the rest of the world. In order to get to different parts of the world, you need a much more planned structures in place. And actually, WHO is probably the best body to do so if it's given the access and the resources. Recently, Emily Thornberry, Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, she wrote a letter to Liz Truss. It's a 4-page letter. And actually, I'm not very tech savvy, so I don't know how to put it into this audience, but I can send it to some people if they want to forward it on. But she actually looks at the whole issue of this COVID vaccination for the world. And there are a number of things that need to happen. So, for example, Biden administration recently in the talk with Whittell talk about the waiver of the vaccine patent, which Sophie also mentioned. But that's just one of the problems. What we actually need is to replicate at speed and scale or what's happening in UK across the world. That means working with the scientific community. That means working with the pharmaceutical companies. And what we need to do is the WHO, because they are probably the best body, to establish a global register of facilities in each region, which could be used for full-scale vaccination production and operations. Because to be honest, the fact that we produce vaccines here and there and then transport it 12,000 miles away is always going to be much more cumbersome. However, if we have a system where we can produce it in the regions, then people can access it much more quickly. And so that requires patency issues being waived. That requires technological and financial support being given to the local sort of operators to be able to set up. It also means, of course, making sure that the ingredients that they need to make the vaccine is also made available as well. And it also means that maybe requiring of training of scientists and other people in vaccine kind of related research across the world. And that needs to be, it's really going to be globally planned by a global organization with all the countries having an input. I think, to me, I think that's probably, I don't know how realistically we can achieve it, but I think that may be the way. And I know Sophie wants to say.
Well, I see some heads nodding, and it's certainly probably more realistic with the current president in the US and the cooperative relationship between them and the WHO than before. And I want to come back to this issue of IP, but first, let's get a snapshot of Nepal. If we can go to Lisbon, ironically, Sophie Roberts, just back from there. As I was just taking a quick look at the latest stats, as I see it, infection numbers are still relatively low. Vaccination numbers are still low. Did it feel as if there was an emergency, a vaccination emergency, and that the shortfall was critical, or were they as relaxed about that as they are about very, very high altitudes?
No, I mean, it was very odd. I went in 3-4 weeks ago with some knowledge, government supplied, about what the situation was. And it rapidly exploded. And what I witnessed was chaos, it was desperate, and the extremes of, the numbers, there's some local newspapers with a dysfunctional government that's got a vacuum at the moment, so nothing that I could get my hands on as a journalist is reliable, and I'm still processing the little that is available to me. But I can only talk anecdotally, and anecdotally, I left Kathmandu on a humanitarian flight, and I went through a wall of smoke. The funeral pyres were burning. There were people at the gates. It was absolutely desperate. That situation and that thick smoke did not speak to the numbers that are being released. So
just to be clear, Sophie, you're talking about evidence of an Indian-style surge in Nepal?
Absolutely.
Or right? Okay.
Absolutely. This was in Kathmandu. I was in the remote countryside area. Before, and I was working in a hospital there that has no ICU bed. It's one of the only hospitals in the Solukhumbu region in eastern Nepal, has no ICU beds. So, the difference between the countryside and the city, that's one thing. Then the difference between that city, Kathmandu, as it went into lockdown, which nobody wanted, as they say, hunger will, if COVID doesn't kill us, hunger will. We talk about self-isolation issues and payments in this country. There, with the first lockdown, one family, the only government handout was a 5-kilogram bag of rice. So it's a completely different set of a spectrum of need and desperation. What I found and I'm still processing this, but what I found particularly acute was going from that situation and flying out via Turkey into Lisbon, which was my only route But I couldn't get a flight to the UK for all the various reasons we know about. What I found absolutely shocking was I came into Lisbon. I'm not being asked to self-isolate here. It's not on their list. And I walk into a Lisbon, which is, this is the closest to a reality that I recognize pre-pandemic. It's functioning here. The sun shines out, the restaurants are open. It's busy, 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 busy. It doesn't feel like there's masks. I don't have to wear it on the street unless the street is busy. That extreme between two places in the space of a 24-hour flight experience is the problem. And I can only speak to it anecdotally, like I say. I just haven't got my grip on those numbers yet, but it is and remains profound.
Is there any evidence at all of a vaccination program underway in Nepal?
Yes, there is. I was working there with doctors and with people involved in the expedition industry. That's a more affluent set of society. A lot of people have had their first vax. The hotel that I was staying, where I was in lockdown in Kathmandu, the members of staff that were on site, sleeping on site, were one vaccination in. So they're trying. There was evidence of it definitely being present, but I got news this morning that hotel's now being closed because the dishwasher, he has now tested positive. So it's just in a sort of state of chaos, really. But definitely it's getting in there, but at the same time it's getting in there, and the only flights that were open between Nepal and the rest of the world was 2 flights a day to India because of the economic relationship between those two countries. It's an open border. So that to me was extraordinary. The skies were silent apart from those planes coming in from India.
Sophie, thank you. I was going to say we can well imagine, but we can't. However, we have had, even at Tortoise, a brief reminder that this week, the sibling of a colleague testing positive. We think for one moment that this thing's behind us, and we get a reminder that it's not. I'd like to go back to David and then to Sophie Harman for their views specifically on the rights and wrongs of forced disclosure of IP. But I noticed Louise Jarvis in the chat has also mentioned this. So we'll come to you as well afterwards, Louise, if we may. But first, David, who's right about this issue? Which, broadly speaking, should vaccine makers be forced to disclose their intellectual property so that others can make their vaccines? Biden broadly says yes. Angela Merkel, for other reasons, says no. What's the best approach in terms of getting vaccines into arms?
Well, I mean, it's an incredibly complex question, and as soon as you get into this, you get into like very, very specifics about the different IP regimes for different vaccines and so on. I mean, on principle, we're in an extraordinary this. I think part of the kind of pushback on this there's, of course, there are people making money from it, but a lot of the vaccines we're talking about are mRNA vaccines, and the people with the expertise to make those vaccines just don't exist. So, with the speed that we need to move, IP is the right thing to do. IP waivers and trip waivers in the medium term, but actually it's not going to fix things, right now. So that's where the dose sharing and the kind of funding for COVAX and so on comes in. And I entirely agree with Sophie. COVAX is not the ideal mechanism. We should have had structures in place, prior to this, and we need to put those in place. It's like, my American colleagues talk about like sticky tape and chewing gum. It's like just like trying to pull something together. And I think we need to have a real hard look at, what are the mechanisms that need to be in place? We need to have like funding ready to go whenever something like this happens. We need to have, thresholds where at some point, IP waivers, emergency measures kick in and everyone just agrees to them, rather than this kind of, political bargaining, which just hasn't worked. And part of that is having strong political leadership that gets the science and is willing to act rapidly and boldly. to respond to the crisis.
Thanks, David. Slightly patchy sound there, but I'm sure that we'll come back to you. Sophie, what, in your view, is the right, in practical terms, approach to this IP problem?
Firstly, the first myth that I would just like to bust is that we need a permission for this IP waiver. It already exists under WTO rules, so that's the World Trade Organization rules. As a consequence of the AIDS crisis in the early 2000s, late 1990s, there's already been an agreement that in an exceptional health emergency, you can waiver IP and states can issue compulsory licenses. They don't because they fear stigma and punishment from the wider trade community, or they lack the capacity to manufacture the vaccines themselves. So technically it's within the rules to do it. And I think that's a really important point that often gets overlooked.
Sorry, can I just interrupt, just to be clear there? So the waiver exists. Who does it fall to invoke it? Can I do it as a manufacturer, or do I need my government to do it on my behalf?
You need to do it, your government to do it on your behalf. So, for example, normally what would happen is, say, if the AIDS case, it was the government of South Africa that really put this to the WTO, who were going to say, we're going to import antiretrovirals for people living with HIV from Brazil and India. And this was the case that said, this is an exceptional crisis. So yeah, the states would do it. So at the moment, I think Bolivia has talked about doing it, and potentially Chile. So yeah, states can do it. But then it comes back to David's point of then, how do you manufacture vaccines? They're technical. You have to share technical capacity. You need to waiver it both on the vaccine intellectual property, but also around sort of the ingredients of the vaccines. So like consumables, materials, things like that. So that's the kind of one thing. Then you have to deal with the whole supply chain issue, which, as we're seeing with the Serum Institute at the moment, is a really big problem. However, sometimes I think we think these issues are so enormous we can't do them. If you look at the massive advances in polio vaccination campaigns in lower middle income countries, there are frameworks there. You can pick up what we've learned from years of these kind of campaigns. WHO can do it, but also, and this is when I'll probably be a bit nicer about COVAX, COVAX sits under the Gavi Alliance, which is this big kind of vaccine initiative. They have huge practice of how to get vaccines into the arms of people in lower middle income countries. And it's the same stuff that, Yasmin was talking about in Bolton, working with community leaders, doing mobile transport into communities instead of saying everybody come to these hubs. It is doable. So what we need to do, and this is what I really hope they talk about at the G7 and G20, is think about how do we do that? This kind of like dose sharing, I think David is quite right, that's a speed issue. But let's start drawing on what we know and putting efforts, development assistance into that. And that is what's going to help get us vaccinated throughout the world quicker and equitably.
So sorry, just to be clear, what are the specific lessons that we should draw from polio?
So polio shows that if you work with community leaders, community health teams, you can get vaccines out into the most rural communities, that you take the vaccines to the people instead of bringing the people to the vaccine. But core, I think everyone says, oh, how do you ever do a mass vaccination campaign in a low income country? You can do it. And I think polio shows it. Also, some of the trials around the Ebola vaccine in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, also shows you can do it. So I think instead of always thinking about the problems, we need to learn from the best lessons learned to avoid some of these, like, the pictures that Sophie was painting from Nepal, that completely reminded me of being in Sierra Leone during the Ebola outbreak. It is terrifying, but we have to think clearly about some of the measures we have in place.
Thank you, Sophie. Louise, I see your message. That's fine. Can we come to Gregory Mulligan, if possible, if he doesn't mind, because he's saying in the chat, wondering whether the big pharma model really works. And I wanted to suggest that it is working, and that, just devil's advocate, if you like, they do need to be incentivized one way or another to keep on, and financed for that matter, producing new vaccines against new variants, against the next pandemic. What do you think, Gregory? I couldn't hear it, David. Anyway, we'll come back to you, Gregory, if we can. his suggestion is that vaccines are a global public good that a central global institution should control. My question is, are we agreed that the WHO is that institution, or has it shown itself to be flawed, for example, in its investigation of the origins of the pandemic? And again, David, Yasmin, I'd be interested in your views on this, or and Sophie, either of the Sophies. Let's come to this Sophie first, Sophie Harman.
Thank you. I think when it actually comes to vaccines, you need WHO actually working with the Gavi Alliance, because the WHO over the last 30 to 50 years has made some missteps with some of these issues, which is partly why you saw the creation of the Gavi Alliance. The WHO, I think, you know, as a global health person, particularly when Trump was criticizing the WHO, I was going on the media saying, support the WHO, support the WHO, but they have made some missteps in this pandemic. And I think they do have to kind of like reflect on that a little bit more. So we have to fund the WHO properly. It's seriously underfunded. And you're going to see at the moment it's the World Health Assembly, and there's going to be calls for this new vaccine treaty and more investment in the WHO. But I think there are some definite lessons learned for the WHO, particularly around its advice on borders, mask wearing, and also kind of ways in which of transmission, which it was a little bit shaky on in the early grounds. So WHO, yes, but also it has to involve the Gavi Alliance if we are going to talk about vaccine rollout, because they really have the expertise there.
Thanks, Sophie. Now, while we're talking, and we do have a reliable link, a lot of your work has been on gender-specific aspects of global public health. Let us imagine for a moment a sub-Saharan African country, let's say the DRC. Let's say that the availability problem is solved. Shipments of drugs, of vaccines have arrived at the right temperature and are usable. Is the role of women in local communities a key factor in uptake, whether as an encourager or as an obstacle? Absolutely. I mean, women are fundamental, and they tend to be the majority of community health workers in all vaccine rollouts. You see this in polio as well. And they're fundamental in getting the vaccines out because people trust women in those kind of work. But there's two issues we have to be really concerned about. Firstly, burdening these volunteers. These women are always not paid or very low paid, so they need to be paid properly. And second, around their security. So if you're working in a context of potential conflict, you need to protect vaccinators. That's really important. And also potential sexual exploitation, which has been a big problem with the DRC, particularly in Ebola. And there was a report even this week about people working for the World Health Organization and abuse of those community health workers working in the Ebola response. So women are absolutely fundamental, but they also need to be paid, and their security has to be paramount. Thank you very much. Can we try again to come to someone in the audience, in this case, James Shepherd-Barron, talking about in the chat about lessons from Ebola. Are you there, James?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. What are those lessons?
Oh, there are many, and I think Sophie probably knows as much as I do, but I was working with what was then DFID at the beginning of the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and it was mostly about the management of the whole thing. There wasn't a vaccine at that point, but it was mostly to do with incentivization, how you pay people when there aren't ATMs or any working bank structure. So a whole system has to be set up. Lessons to do with lab technicians in the Congo, particularly, how to get them paid, because when you're working on something like Ebola, that's a pretty dangerous job to have.
And what
so there are lots of practical things.
What payment systems were set up?
Basically prepaid debit cards, so that right. A government or a donor tends to think that if money has left the capital and it's gone into a bank account, then the job is done. But it isn't, because how does the lab technician get hold of the cash and go to the market to buy the food for which they need, like anybody else does, because they end up taking 3 or 4 days to get the cash, get the food, and get back to their job. So the whole cycle of how you do it. And then when it comes to things like research and development, the people working on the ground don't always get told what's going on because there's money in the data, and Big Pharma isn't very keen on sharing its data. And that's extremely technical, and it's what WHO excels at, which is often not talked about. And so when a vaccine eventually gets developed, how do you roll it out? How do you incentivize the rollout? Sophie was talking about, I think it was Sophie, about the security situation. You know, if you're dealing with people who think you're only doing it to save yourself, you foreigners, and they're people who turn around and say, you know, we have as many people die, well, 10 times more of our children are dying from cholera than Ebola, but you're not doing anything about that. You've got a whole heap of risk communication barriers to get over before you can get people starting to believe in vaccinating. So the lessons learned for anti-vaxxers are massive. I mean, starting with the color of the labeling, I mean, it just goes on and on. So there's an awful lot of lessons learned, and an awful lot of people, especially in HMG, in the British government, I think have yet to learn them. Let's put it like that.
That's a really interesting point, and I'd be interested in both Sophie's and David's response to that idea that vaccinating the world is ultimately a self-interested project from the rich countries' point of view, and might be seen as that. And I want to come to all of you before we run out of time. But very briefly, if we can come to Lindsay Evans, who makes the point, you need the funds to develop the new vaccines. Lindsay, if we've got audio with you, what do I infer from that about your view about this whole IP question and incentivizing pharma?
It was a reply to Gregory saying vaccine should be a public good. And my concern with that was that if you remove the pharmaceutical incentive, then where will the funding for the new vaccines come from? COVID has been a unique situation where AstraZeneca has, you know, waived a lot of the profit. But I wasn't really talking about profit. I was really talking about, if you're going to make something a public good, an international good, just where will the money come from? Because if you're not developing the new vaccines, then you're not dealing with the new variants, you're not dealing with the new Ebola, and then you're putting the world at greater jeopardy in a way that you weren't intending. Right.
Okay, thanks very much. As I say, time is running short. Let me come back to Sophie Roberts first. Danny, I see your hand up and we'll come to you in a second. Sophie, if you were had the opportunity to go back to Nepal, what would be the single most urgent priority, do you think, urgent need to meet locally? Are they screaming, first of all, for vaccines or for something else?
No, they're not screaming for vaccines. They're screaming for tourism. They're screaming for the remittance economy to get back up and running. They are living with other diseases and other horrors in that world. They just want their economy to work. You know, these are people that are on a daily wage to pay for yesterday's meal. So they have a different, they have a different set of priorities. I think Kathmandu now is going through the reality of COVID, but in the remote communities, they just aren't understanding it yet. It's so hard. That was what I found particularly difficult, is they were just like, can you just bring the people back? Can you bring tourists back to this country? You know, these people haven't been paid for 18 months, nothing. And so it's a different set of priorities. There's one thing I want to just pick up on as well, is the comment about WHO. And one of the things that I kept on coming across was because of bad news, the fear around AstraZeneca, that like the English vaccine was regarded with real fear, even among those communities that could get access to it. Whereas WHO has a kind of brand power in a country like that. It's odd, you know, you still see it on the bags, you know, that are being reused at airports or wherever the hell it is. So I feel quite strongly, I don't know what the reality is in global health policy and all the rest of it, but in terms of brand power in an uneducated rural communities who mean something. It means more than this AstraZeneca thing.
That's an interesting point to remember. Thank you. Danny, I promised we'd come to you. Is your hand still up? I don't see it. Danny
Yes.
H. Yes.
Yes, sorry, try to unmute. I'm terribly sorry. I'm based in New York and of course thought that the time was for New York. So I just joined. But one of the things that I've been working for the past 25 years on neglected tropical diseases, which, unlike some of the other diseases of public health importance, look at doing mass drug administration for the complete communities at district level. And for the past 20 years, we've made incredible progress with treating hundreds of millions of people in Africa and Asia, where we really, for trachoma, for example, with the donation program from Pfizer for Zithromax, we are now at treating around 90 million people, starting with children as young as 1 month old to everybody in the community. This is done by volunteers that are getting a couple of days education around how to distribute tablets, how to look at doing the dosing, who needs to receive pediatric oral solutions. And we're reaching incredible coverage of 95% in certain places, and everywhere it is above 80% of the population that we reach. And that is, of course, necessary within our elimination programs. And I would see that these could be incredible examples when we're looking at the vaccine rollout. How do we use infrastructures that are already targeting complete communities, complete districts, and where we have huge coverage? And because this is done through the community volunteers, they do not seek, at least in our cases, funding. We just give them a per diem for when they are attending a training session, and we provide them with lunch, and that is it. And the communities actually provide these people with a lot of support. Within the river blindness program, we've been really promoting for communities to help a couple of days in the gardens of those volunteers that spend days doing the distribution. And I think we need to really look at some of those experiences as well, because there are great experiences of reaching huge numbers of people.
Danny, thank you very much. I'm sorry that we've so pushed for time. Just, I want to give a final last word to David, Sophie Harman, and Yasmin on the single most important blockages that need to be unblocked to vaccinate the world. The last few contributions have been about local communities. Let's start, David, if we may. What is the most urgent task?
Well, I think we need a global plan to reach herd immunity, and that means like removing the barrier of not having enough money, investing in education and some of the things that Sophie and James have talked about in terms of vaccine hesitancy and addressing those issues. And there is a spillover from the kinds of announcements that the EU made, for example, in suspending AstraZeneca, that had major impacts on DRC. So we need to be thinking about that quite carefully. And then, because of the urgency, we need to get these excess doses to people that need them, along with all the supply chain issues, the rollout, cold chain, health workers, and so on. That's going to cost a lot of money, but in the context of the humanitarian, diplomatic, and economic costs that this is, wreaking on the whole world, it's a drop in the ocean.
Thank you very much. Point well taken. Sophie Harman, biggest single task, most urgent.
Share the intellectual property, share the technology, mobilize communities in the country to then get those vaccines out there. As James and Sophie were saying, if you don't engage the communities, they're the ones that can actually translate why these vaccines matter and why people will take them. If you just turn up in a country of vaccines, everyone will be like, who are you, foreigner, not taking them?
And back, Yasmin, finally, thank you to Bolton. Or if there's a point that you want to make about the bigger picture, do you feel that you've learned lessons in Bolton that are more broadly applicable?
I think the lesson we learned in Bolton is very simply that the best way to get vaccine out to people is in the communities, and that's a picture across the world. But I think the real big picture in all of this, and it's where I started off with, is that until governments across the world, especially those with the big pockets, are willing to put forward monies into a system which looks at all the different regions, does the assessment of what the needs are, where the technological issues are, the production issues, because in order to get the vaccine out to those countries and then down to people, they need to be produced in the regions. I don't think you can have a couple of factories 10,000 miles away, 12,000 miles away making these things. They've got to be made within the region so they're easy transportable. Well, that requires the international community to bring technology together, financial procurement as well, and everything that goes with it. And I don't know whether the international community is ready for that and they want to actually do it.
Thank you all very much. And by the way, my colleague Katie was sort of echoing what Yasmin said earlier about the idea of rolling out the UK model elsewhere, because it is something that seems to have worked here. We didn't get onto the applicability of that, but I did learn several really interesting things. I mean, I think one thing that came across from everybody, the essential role of local communities for what I think postal services call the last mile. The importance of involving the WHO, which, as Sophie Roberts was saying, has brand value and is a known entity in places where COVAX, for example, might not be. Share the IP. There's a whole discussion to be had on that and how you continue to incentivize some really pretty expensive and cutting edge science. If you do that, that's perhaps for another time. Sharing the surpluses clearly and coming up with money, which, as David said, is a drop in the ocean compared with the cost of not getting this right. So it's 4 minutes past. You know, I think this has turned out to be one of those questions to which there is an answer. It's all there on the shelf, as it were. It's complex, but it's not as complicated as solving global warming. And it would be a crying shame if over the next 12 months, many of the things that we've discussed today were not actually put into practice. Eroding the huge difference that we see and that Sophie Roberts saw between Nepal now and Portugal now. Anyway, it's 5 past. I've kept you on. Sorry about that. Thank you all very much for your contributions. Do join us again next Friday, but also for Think-Ins before then next week. And have a great weekend. Thanks a lot.